Fight! Superb! 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 Liu Kang wins. Round 2. Fight! Superb! Finish him! Liu Kang wins. Flawless victory. Round 1. Fight! Liu Kang wins. Round 2. Fight! Finish it. Liu Kang wins. Fatality. Round 1. Fight! Liu Kang wins. Round 2. Fight! Finish him. Liu Kang wins. Fatality. Round 1. Fight! Superb! Liu Kang wins. Round 2. Fight! wins. Round 3, fight. Finish him. Liu Kang wins. Fatality. Round 1, fight. Liu Kang wins. Round 2, fight. Finisher. Liu Kang wins. Fatality. Round 1, fight. Liu Kang wins. Round 2, fight. Finish him. Liu Kang wins. Fatality. Round 1, fight. Liu Kang wins. Round 2, fight. Superb. Fatality. Round 1. Fight! Liu Kang wins. Round 2. Fight! Finish her. Liu Kang wins. Fatality. Round 1. Fight! Liu Kang wins. Round 2. Fight! Finish him. Liu Kang wins. Fatality. Round 1. Fight! Liu Kang wins. Round 2. Fight! Finish him. Liu Kang wins. Round 1. Fight! Come here! Fatality. Round 1. Fight! Liu Kang wins. Round 2. Fight! Finish him! Liu Kang wins. Fatality. Round 1. Fight! Liu Kang wins. Round 2. Fight! Liu Kang wins. You will die, mortal. You will die, Is that your best?